Flight attendant insults black family. 5 minutes later, they reveal their power and spark. Change. A family steps into the first-class cabin of a prestigious airline, their confidence and success reflected in every detail of their presence. Yet a flight attendant, clouded by deep-seated prejudice, decides they don't belong. Her dismissive remarks and hostile actions set off a chain of events she could never have foreseen. By the end of this flight, her perception of justice and respect will be turned upside down, and the airline industry itself will feel the ripples of change. What happens when dignity and resilience collide with bias? This is a gripping story of courage, unity, and a powerful stand for justice, all unfolding at 35,000 feet. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. If you're inspired by stories about justice and resilience, don't forget to hit the like, share this video, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that spark meaningful change. Your engagement helps us bring these impactful tales to even more people. Now, let's begin. Karen Miller adjusted her glasses and scanned the passenger list for flight LAX JFK. Her eyes flicked down the screen, pausing momentarily at the name Thomas. It wasn't unusual, just another name on another flight. Yet something about it made her pause. Setting the tablet down, she took a sip of her now lukewarm coffee. The morning's usual routine felt slightly off, but she pushed the thought aside. Karen had been with Pacific Air for over 20 years, and she prided herself on being unshakable, a pillar of efficiency in a world that seemed to value chaos. The crew lounge buzzed faintly with murmured conversations, the occasional clink of coffee cups punctuating the air. Karen sat alone, reviewing her mental checklist. Her reputation preceded her, strict, thorough, and unwavering in her adherence to protocol. To Karen, these were virtues, the foundation of her professional success. Younger colleagues, however, whispered words like rigid and uncompromising. She dismissed such labels as generational misunderstandings. They didn't appreciate discipline, she thought, not like she did. Her gaze drifted toward the clock on the wall, and her mind wandered to the unconscious bias training session she had attended weeks ago. The memory surfaced unbidden, tightening her jaw. It was supposed to be a routine session, just another box to tick on her annual training requirements. Instead, it had felt like an ambush. A young, eager instructor had filled the room with data and stories about systemic discrimination in the airline industry, claims Karen had immediately dismissed. "I've been doing this job for over 20 years, she had said, her voice firm and steady. "I've treated every passenger the same, regardless of who they are. If someone gets flagged, it's because there's a reason. The system doesn't lie." The instructor, unfazed, had replied, "Sometimes the system reflects the biases of those who create it. That's why training like this matters." Karen had folded her arms, letting silence fall around her. The others in the room had remained quiet, their expressions unreadable. Only Sarah Goldman, a young FAA representative seated at the back, had caught Karen's attention. Sarah's face betrayed no reaction, but her pen moved steadily across, her notebook recording every word. That quiet observation had irritated Karen even more than the instructor's rebuttal. A voice nearby snapped her back to the present. "Karen, meeting's starting," a colleague said, motioning toward the briefing room. She gathered her things and walked in, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. The crew was already assembled, and Captain David Chen stood at the front, his calm authority commanding the room. "As you all know, today's flight has heightened scrutiny," he began, his tone measured. "The FAA is monitoring our operations closely, and I expect everyone to adhere to the highest standards of professionalism." Karen felt her irritation simmer. She didn't need reminders to do her job properly. She had built her career on precision. Around her, the younger crew members exchanged glances, the kind that spoke of unspoken understanding. Karen ignored them, focusing instead on the captain's instructions. After the meeting, She approached Captain Chen. "What exactly is the FAA looking for?" she asked, her voice low but firm. "They're assessing fairness in service interactions." He replied, "This is about ensuring equity for all passengers." Karen nodded curtly, though his words left a bitter taste in her mouth. Equity. The word was everywhere these days, often wielded as a weapon to undermine tradition and order. To Karen, fairness had always been about following the rules, not bending them to fit someone else's narrative. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She stepped away from the group to answer. "Karen Miller," she said briskly. "Ms. Miller, this is Officer Delgado from Security," a voice replied. "We've got a flagged family running late for boarding. SSS." Karen's brow furrowed. Secondary Security Screening Selection, SSSS, meant additional checks. "What's the situation?" she asked, her tone neutral. "They're cleared." "Now, but they caused delays at the checkpoint. Just wanted to give you a heads up." "Understood," Karen replied before ending the call. Delays weren't unusual, but SSSS passengers often came with complications, whether it was heightened scrutiny or the stress of the process itself. She made a mental note to keep an eye on the situation. Returning to her preparations, Karen couldn't shake a lingering unease. The morning had already carried an undercurrent of tension, and the flagged family felt like another piece in a puzzle she hadn't yet solved. The name Thomas drifted back into her thoughts, though she couldn't pinpoint why it stood out. For now, she focused on the tasks ahead, unaware that this ordinary flight would challenge not just her professionalism, but the very principles she thought she stood for. Karen glanced at the clock again. The minutes ticked by steadily, but her sense of control felt elusive. She took a deep breath and steeled herself. Whatever was coming, she would handle it. She always had. The cacophony of the security checkpoint was a symphony of clattering bins, the hum of conveyor belts, and the occasional beep of a scanner. Amid the commotion, Michael Thomas stood tall, his calm presence a stark contrast to the hurried energy. Around him, he guided his family through the process with practiced ease, though his composed exterior masked a deep-seated frustration. This wasn't the first time they had been flagged for additional screening, and he doubted it would be the last. As he slipped off his belt and placed their neatly packed carry-ons onto the conveyor belt, Michael caught his wife's eye. Michelle, standing a step behind him, had her phone held discreetly at chest level, recording the entire interaction. She offered a tight smile, a silent assurance that she was documenting everything. Beside her, their teenage son, James, adjusted. The angle of his phone's camera, his live broadcast already underway. "Good morning, everyone," James murmured into the lens, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "It's James Thomas, and we're live at LAX for another episode of Travel While Black. Looks like we've been selected for some extra random screening. Let's see how this goes." Michael caught the comment but didn't react. He admired his son's quiet defiance, the way James used his platform to shed light on the microaggressions that had become a routine part of their travel experience. But admiration was tinged with unease. This wasn't the world Michael had hoped to hand down to his children. "Step forward, sir," a security officer directed. Michael complied without hesitation, moving with deliberate calm. The handheld scanner traced predictable paths along his frame, pausing now and then as the officer checked his waistband and shoes. The process was familiar, mechanical, almost scripted. "You're good to go," the officer finally said, motioning him forward. Michael collected his belongings and stepped aside, his shoulders loosening slightly. Michelle stepped up next, her phone still recording. She greeted the officer with polite efficiency, her movements precise and deliberate. When the scanner beeped unexpectedly at her wrist, she adjusted her bracelet without missing a beat. Nothing fazed Michelle, not when she had a mission. Her meticulous documentation of moments like these had become a quiet rebellion. a refusal to let injustice pass unnoticed. Behind her, James faced the scanner, the light from his phone casting a faint glow on his face. His live stream captured not only the screening, but also the murmurs of other passengers. "They're holding up the line again," someone muttered audibly, and James's camera shifted slightly, catching the speaker's image before returning to the scene ahead. He didn't say anything, but his steady, unwavering expression spoke volumes. Once through, the family regrouped near the benches by the checkpoint. Michael began methodically reassembling his belt and shoes, his mind drifting as he worked. 20 years earlier, he had stood in a different airport, holding his medical bag and a boarding pass. He was an emergency physician back then, trying to catch a flight to a small-town hospital where a child needed life-saving surgery. The gate agent had blocked his way, citing flagged status. No amount of pleading or explanation had changed the outcome. He missed that flight, and the child didn't survive the night. The memory was an open wound that had never fully healed, a moment that drove him to file a lawsuit against the airline. It was a long, grueling process, but he won. The case forced airlines to review their screening procedures, a small victory in the broader fight against systemic bias. Yet, as he watched his son document another so-called random screening, Michael couldn't help but feel the weight of unfinished business. The victory had been real, but the war was far from over. Michelle's phone buzzed, pulling Michael from his thoughts. She stepped a few feet away and answered, her voice clipped and professional. "This is Michelle Thomas," she said. The voice on the other end spoke quickly, the words clipped but urgent. "Michelle, it's the ACLU. We've got a major case involving racial profiling in air travel. We've obtained data from multiple airlines showing a clear pattern of bias. Your family's experiences could be instrumental in building our case." Michelle's brows furrowed as she absorbed the details. Her phone buzzed again, notifications from James's live stream filling the screen. The ACLU representative continued, outlining plans for a large-scale advocacy campaign. The weight of the conversation settled heavily on Michelle's shoulders, but she felt a spark of determination ignite within her. "We'll help," she said firmly. "Whatever you need." As she ended the call, Michelle turned to her family. Michael raised a questioning brow, but she shook her head. "Not now," she murmured. They still had a flight to catch. Unbeknownst to them, a few gates away, Sarah Goldman sat quietly in a corner of the terminal. Her tablet rested against her knees, a data report on flagged passengers glowing on the screen. For weeks, she'd been compiling information as part of an FAA initiative to monitor discrimination in air travel. A notification popped up on her device. "Travel while black. Live now." Curious, she clicked the link. James's live stream played out before her, the shaky footage showing him navigating the checkpoint while narrating softly. Sarah's breath caught as recognition dawned. The Thomas family wasn't just another statistic in her report. They were the very case she'd been tasked to monitor. Watching James's steady composure as he captured their experience, Sarah felt a pang of unease. This wasn't just about data anymore. This was personal. Closing the live stream, she leaned back in her seat, her thoughts swirling. The Thomases were on her flight. She was sure of it. And today, their journey could mark a turning point, not just for them, but for the entire industry. The Thomas family approached the boarding gate with measured steps, their calm exterior a deliberate choice against the tension that seemed to follow them. Michelle carried herself with practiced composure, her phone discreetly tucked into her purse, but ready if needed. Michael walked beside her, his hand gently resting on James's shoulder. They were determined not to let the morning's inconvenience define the rest of their day. Karen Miller stood at the gate, her sharp eyes scanning the line of passengers. Her gaze landed on the Thomases, and her posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. There they were, the flagged family from earlier, She immediately took note of their coordinated movements, their unhurried demeanor. Her mind flicked back to the passenger list. Thomas. The name had nagged at her earlier, and now, seeing them in person, she couldn't shake her unease. The family handed over their boarding passes without hesitation, but Karen hesitated for a fraction of a second before scanning them. "Could you wait here for a moment?" she said, her tone neutral but firm. Michael exchanged a brief glance with Michelle, who stepped forward. "Is there an issue with our boarding passes?" she asked, her voice steady. Karen glanced down at the tickets, searching for something, anything, that might warrant additional scrutiny. "Just routine," she replied, though the word felt hollow even as she said it. Michelle's expression remained calm. "Routine doesn't typically involve holding passengers at the gate," she said evenly, her voice just loud enough for nearby travelers to hear. "Our tickets were cleared at security." Karen bristled but maintained her composure. "I'll need to verify these again. Please step aside." By now, the subtle exchange had drawn the attention of other passengers. A few shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others began discreetly filming. James, standing quietly to the side, held his phone low, but angled perfectly to capture the moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," Karen addressed the other travelers, her voice taking on an edge of authority, "please remain seated while we resolve this." "Resolve what?" Michael asked, his voice calm but firm. His question hung in the air, a quiet challenge that seemed to ripple through the gate area. Nearby, a passenger murmured, "Here we go again." But it wasn't clear whether the tone was one of annoyance or solidarity. Karen turned back to the Thomases, her lips pressing into a thin line. Before she could respond, Michelle spoke again. "We'd like to board now," she said, her tone carrying a weight that made Karen hesitate. "Unless there's a legal reason preventing us from doing so, I assume we have the same rights as every other passenger." The room felt charged, the low hum of conversations and camera clicks growing louder. Karen's gaze darted to a uniformed colleague standing a few feet away, but no support came. Instead, she nodded stiffly and handed back their tickets. "You may board," she said, her voice clipped. The family stepped onto the jet bridge, but the tension lingered behind them. Karen turned toward the gate desk, her frustration evident. She caught sight of Sarah Goldman, seated nearby, her expression unreadable. Sarah's presence felt like a silent reminder of the scrutiny Karen had dismissed as unnecessary. Karen straightened her shoulders and walked briskly toward the cockpit, determination etched into her every step. Inside the plane, the Thomases settled into their seats. James whispered, "Mum, did you see how many people were recording?" His voice held both curiosity and a hint of pride. Michelle smiled faintly. "People notice when something doesn't feel right," she said, her tone more thoughtful than reassuring. "That's why we stay calm, James. The truth speaks louder when you don't have to yell it." Michael leaned back in his seat, his fingers loosely clasped together. "It's not just about staying calm," he murmured. "It's about knowing when to act. Today was the first step." As James pulled out his phone, the notifications started pouring in. His live stream was gaining traction quickly, the hashtag #GFlyingWhileBlack already appearing in comments. "Mom," he whispered, tilting his phone toward her. Michelle glanced at the screen, her lips tightening briefly before she nodded. "Good," she said simply. "People need to see this." Back at the gate, Karen was met by Captain David Chen in the cockpit. His calm, authoritative presence filled the small space. "What's going on out there?" he asked, his tone steady but firm. Karen crossed her arms. "I was following protocol. That family raised some red flags." "Red flags," Captain Chen repeated, his expression unchanging. "And what exactly were these red flags?" Karen hesitated. "Their tickets were flagged at security earlier. And security cleared them, didn't they?" he pressed, his tone still calm, but with a subtle edge. Karen nodded reluctantly. "Yes, but—" "Karen," Chen interrupted gently but firmly. "We've been briefed about today's flight. We're under FAA scrutiny. Every action we take is being watched, not just by the FAA, but by the passengers, and most likely the public." She frowned, but didn't respond immediately. Chen continued, "If you have genuine concerns, bring them to me. Otherwise, we're here to ensure a smooth flight for everyone. Everyone." Karen exhaled sharply, the tension in her shoulders still unresolved. "Understood," she said curtly. Chen nodded, watching her closely for a moment before stepping out of the cockpit. Karen lingered behind, her mind racing. She felt as though she'd been undermined, but part of her knew the captain was right. The growing awareness of cameras and eyes on her actions only deepened her frustration. As the plane began to board fully, the ripple effects of the confrontation continued to spread. Passengers whispered about the exchange at the gate, with some checking their phones for the latest updates. In the digital ether, James's live stream was already gaining traction, with viewers sharing it across platforms. Comments poured in, ranging from outrage to support. Flying while black wasn't just a trending tag, it was a call for accountability, one Karen could feel pressing against her like a weight she couldn't shake. Unseen by her, Sarah Goldman sat quietly in her assigned seat, her FAA-issued tablet open on her lap. She refreshed her screen, watching as the live updates rolled in. The confrontation at the gate wasn't just a momentary disruption. It was the beginning of something far larger. Sarah's fingers hovered over her keyboard as she considered what to document next. Whatever happened on this flight, she knew one thing for certain. The stakes had never been higher. The plane hummed with the low murmur of passengers settling into their seats, but the tension from the boarding gate lingered like a storm cloud. Karen Miller stood outside the cockpit, the clipped heels of her shoes echoing faintly on the aircraft floor. Her thoughts churned as she replayed the confrontation with the Thomases. She had handled it professionally, at least that's what she told herself. Still, Captain Chen's calm but firm words at the gate gnawed at her. "Karen!" the captain's voice called from the cockpit. She straightened her shoulders, exhaling sharply before stepping in. Captain David Chen sat in the pilot's chair, reviewing the flight plan. His demeanor was calm, but his eyes were sharp as he looked up. "We need to talk about what happened at the gate." Karen closed the door behind her and crossed her arms. "I was following protocol," she said, her voice defensive. Chen raised an eyebrow, and yet it escalated. "They were flagged earlier at security," Karen argued. "I had every right to ensure everything was in order." "And security cleared them," Chen replied evenly. "Karen, we're flying under FAA scrutiny today. Every move we make reflects on this crew and this airline. You need to ask yourself, was that truly about protocol, or was it something else?" The words landed like a challenge. Karen hesitated, unsure how to respond. Chen leaned back, his tone softening. "Look, I'm not here to accuse anyone, but I've been in this industry long enough to know what bias, conscious or unconscious, can look like. You're not the only one who's had to navigate these waters." His gaze shifted momentarily, as if recalling something distant. "When I started flying, I was one of the few Asian American pilots in my company. Passengers used to question whether I was qualified to be in the cockpit." His lips pressed into a thin line. "Even some crew members doubted me. It took years to earn their respect." Karen's arms fell to her sides. She hadn't expected this. Jen's words didn't feel like a reprimand, but rather an invitation to reflect. Before she could respond, a knock at the cockpit door interrupted them. "Captain Chen." Sarah Goldman's voice was quiet, but authoritative. Chen motioned for her to enter. Sarah stepped in, holding a tablet with a steady grip. "I thought it would be helpful to share some data," she began, her tone measured. She glanced at Karen briefly, then directed her attention to Chen. "The FAA has been monitoring flagged passengers across major airlines. The trends are concerning. Families like the Thomases are disproportionately selected for additional screenings. Karen stiffened. Are you suggesting I acted out of bias? Sarah didn't flinch. I'm suggesting we examine patterns. Data helps us see the bigger picture, beyond individual moments. Chen nodded thoughtfully. Thank you, Sarah. Keep me updated. She left as quietly as she'd come, leaving the cockpit heavy with unspoken tension. In the cabin, passengers had begun to share their own murmured stories. A woman in a headscarf sat near the Thomases, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her voice was soft but steady as she leaned toward Michelle. It happens to me too. Nearly every time I travel. They call it random, but it never feels that way. Michelle nodded, her expression empathetic. It's exhausting, she replied. Not just the screening, but the assumptions. Across the aisle, an older black man spoke up, his voice carrying more weight. I served my country for 30 years, he said, his gaze distant. You'd think wearing a uniform would mean something, but to them, we're all suspects. James, sitting beside him, had already started recording. He turned the camera slightly, capturing the man's weathered face. Would you mind sharing your story for my blog? He asked, gently. The man hesitated, then nodded. Maybe it'll make a difference, he murmured. The cabin seemed to hum with a shared energy, passengers quietly acknowledging each other's experiences. James's phone buzzed as his live stream continued to gain traction. Comments poured. In some expressing outrage, others sharing similar stories. In the galley, Karen prepared drinks for the service, her movements mechanical. She overheard snippets of passengers' conversations, their voices blending into a chorus of lived experience. It was unsettling. These weren't isolated incidents, they were a pattern, one she could no longer ignore. Karen, a voice interrupted her thoughts. It was Captain Chen again, his presence filling the narrow space. Management just contacted us. The FAA is now monitoring this flight in real time. Her hands froze. What does that mean for us? She asked. It means, Chen said carefully, that everything we do matters even more. How we treat every passenger, how we respond to every situation, it's all under scrutiny. Karen nodded slowly, the weight of his words sinking in. For the first time, she felt the enormity of the situation, not just for her, but for everyone on board. As the flight settled into its rhythm, the stories shared by passengers continued to ripple outward. James's live stream had been picked up by a small news outlet, amplifying its reach. Michelle scrolled through the comments, her expression thoughtful. People are paying attention, she said to Michael. They should, Michael replied. It's time for change. Unseen by most, Sarah Goldman sat quietly in her seat, her FAA-issued tablet open on her lap. She refreshed the screen, watching as live data streamed in. The tension aboard this flight was a microcosm of a much larger issue, and she knew the eyes of the industry were watching. Whatever happened next would set the tone, not just for this flight, but for the conversations yet to come. The hum of the aircraft blended with the occasional murmur of passengers, but the air felt heavier now. Karen Miller moved purposefully down the aisle, her tray balanced with practiced precision. Yet her thoughts were far from the task at hand. Captain Chen's words echoed in her mind. Bias, conscious or unconscious, they had unsettled her more than she cared to admit, poking at a truth she wasn't ready to confront. The weight of the FAA's scrutiny only added to her discomfort, each step she took feeling observed, recorded, judged. She reached a row near the middle of the plane where Michael Thomas was seated. He looked up as she approached, his calm gaze steady. She handed him a cup of water, their eyes meeting briefly. Karen felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, an unease that wasn't about protocol, but about perception. Did he see her as the enemy, as another cog in a system that had failed him and his family time and again? Across the aisle, Michelle sat, With her phone open, scrolling through documents she had saved, the conversation with the ACLU earlier played in her mind, and she decided it was time to act. She turned to the woman in the headscarf seated beside her, who had earlier shared her story of profiling. "I've been working on research about discrimination in air travel," Michelle began softly. "If you're interested, I'd love to share some of the findings with you." The woman nodded, curiosity lighting her eyes. Michelle opened a file and began explaining patterns of racial disparities, showing charts and graphs that painted a stark picture. Nearby, passengers leaned. Subtly, their interest peaked. As Michelle spoke, her voice grew steadier, more resolute. This was her way of fighting back, not with anger, but with evidence, with truth. Karen, passing by, caught snippets of the conversation. She paused, watching as Michelle's quiet authority seemed to draw the passengers closer. A pang of defensiveness flared within her, but it was quickly followed by something more unsettling: doubt. Were these patterns real? Had she been so focused on following the rules that she'd ignored the broader impact of those rules? Back in the galley, Karen took a moment to steady herself. The small, enclosed space felt like a reprieve. But her mind offered no such escape. She remembered another time she'd felt similarly, sitting across the dinner table from her daughter Emily. It had been years ago, on a quiet Sunday evening. Emily, freshly graduated and brimming with the conviction of a young civil rights activist, had been challenging Karen's views. "Mom, you don't see it because you don't have to live it," Emily had said, her voice both pleading and firm. "You work in a system that's designed to look neutral, but isn't. People like you uphold it without even realizing." Karen had dismissed her then, waving off Emily's words as youthful idealism. "Emily, I've been in this industry for decades. I know how it works," she'd said. "Fairness is about treating everyone the same." Emily had shaken her head, frustration etched into her features. "Fairness is about equity, not sameness. If you can't see the difference, then you're in part of the problem." The memory stung now, sharper than Karen expected. At the time, she had chalked up their disagreements to a generational divide, but maybe Emily had been right. Maybe she had been too entrenched in her ways to see the cracks forming beneath her. In the cabin, a commotion drew her attention. A passenger, clearly agitated, was speaking loudly to a flight attendant near the front. Karen hurried to assess the situation, but stopped short when she saw Michael already there. He stood between the flight attendant and the passenger, his presence calm but commanding. "Sir," Michael said gently, "I understand your frustration, but let's take a moment to breathe. We're all trying to get to the same place safely." His voice carried the steady authority of someone used to diffusing high-stakes situations. The passenger hesitated, then nodded reluctantly, his anger subsiding. Michael turned to the flight attendant. "Maybe a glass of water for him," he suggested. The attendant nodded, hurrying off. Karen watched, a mix of admiration and discomfort swirling within her. Michael's ability to diffuse the tension reminded her of the calm she'd seen in emergency responders. It wasn't about control or authority. It was about connection, something she realized she had been lacking in her approach. As the flight settled again, Karen returned to the galley where Captain Chen was waiting. His expression was unreadable, but his tone was measured. "Karen, the FAA is escalating their involvement," he said. "I just received word from the Inspector General's office. This flight is now part of a formal investigation." Karen's stomach sank. "What does that mean for us?" "It means," Chen said carefully, "that we need to approach every interaction with care. No assumptions, no shortcuts. This isn't just about you or me, it's about setting a precedent." Karen nodded, but her mind raced. The weight of the scrutiny felt suffocating, yet there was no escaping it. For the first time, she began to see the bigger picture, not just the rules she had followed, but the lives those rules impacted. Meanwhile, Sarah Goldman sat quietly in her seat, her tablet balanced on her lap. Notifications from the FAA system flashed on the screen, each one underscoring the gravity of the situation. She glanced toward the Thomases, their calm presence a stark contrast to the storm brewing around them. Sarah refreshed her screen, her fingers hesitating over the keyboard. She had a report to write, but more than that, she had a responsibility to capture not just the facts, but the truth. The cabin hummed with subdued activity, passengers shifting in their seats, flight attendants moving with mechanical efficiency. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet storm was brewing. Sarah Goldman sat in her assigned seat, her tablet open on the tray table. The data flowing in from the FAA system felt like a pulse, steady, insistent, alive. She glanced toward Captain Chen, who was walking down the aisle, his movements purposeful but unhurried. This was the moment to act. When Chen returned to the galley, Sarah followed, her tablet tucked securely under her arm. She hesitated for a beat before speaking. "Captain Chen," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough weight to draw his attention. He turned, eyebrows raised. "Yes? I need to disclose something," she said, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "I'm an FAA investigator. This flight is part of a larger study on systemic bias in air travel." Chen's expression didn't change, but his stance shifted, signaling his full attention. "Go on." Sarah's voice remained steady as she outlined her mission. "We've been monitoring flagged passengers and service interactions across multiple airlines. This flight is a key part of the study due to the Thomases' experiences and the growing public attention." Chen nodded thoughtfully. "And the incident at the gate? It's already logged," Sarah replied, "but the bigger picture is what matters. The patterns are undeniable." Karen Miller, who had entered the galley moments earlier, froze at the edge of their conversation. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but Sarah's words struck like a thunderclap. "This flight is part of your study," Karen interjected, her voice tinged with disbelief. Sarah turned to her, her gaze calm but unwavering. "Yes. Your actions, like everyone else's on this flight, contribute to the data we're collecting." Karen's stomach churned. She felt exposed, as though every decision she had made that day was being scrutinized under a microscope. "I was following protocol," she said defensively. "Protocol isn't immune to bias," Sarah said gently. "That's why we're here, to understand how these systems affect people." Karen's breath caught, but she couldn't muster a response. Instead, she nodded stiffly and left the galley, her mind racing. Meanwhile, in the cabin, James's live stream continued to gain traction. Notifications flooded his phone, the comments scrolling too quickly for him to keep up. Unbelievable. This happens way too often. Stay strong, Thomases. We're with you. Flying while black is trending. Keep it going. Passengers around him had begun to notice the buzz. A young woman leaned over from the row behind. "Are you the one filming?" she asked. When James nodded, she smiled faintly. "Good, people need to see this." Michelle, seated beside him, noticed the growing energy among the passengers. She leaned closer to James. "How many viewers?" she asked quietly. "Over 20,000, he replied, his voice tinged with disbelief. "And it's climbing." Michelle exhaled slowly. "Good," she said. "Let's make it count." James turned his camera toward a passenger a few rows up, a black veteran who had earlier shared his experiences of bias. "Sir, would you mind saying a few words for the live stream?" James asked respectfully. The man hesitated, then nodded. "I served this country for 30 years, he began, his voice firm. "But no uniform could protect me from being seen as less than. It's time for that to change." As James captured the moment, Michelle watched with quiet pride. Her son wasn't just documenting an injustice, he was amplifying voices, building a narrative that couldn't be ignored. In the airline's operations center, executives huddled around a monitor, the tension palpable. The hashtag #ShitFlyingWhileBlack was trending globally, and major news outlets had begun picking up the story. One executive turned to the communications director. "We need a statement," he said sharply. "Now." "On it," the director replied, typing furiously. "But we're already behind. This is spreading faster than we can contain it." Back on the plane, Sarah refreshed her tablet, her face tight with concentration. The livestream's reach had grown exponentially, and the FAA's internal channels were lighting up with updates. She knew this was no longer just about data. It was a flashpoint, a moment that could catalyze real change. Karen, sitting in the jump seat near the galley, stared out the small window. The enormity of the situation was beginning to sink in. She thought of her daughter, Emily, and the countless debates they'd had over dinner. "Fairness is about equity, not sameness," Emily had said, her voice ringing in Karen's ears. The thought made her glance at the passenger manifest, a habit she often fell into when her mind wandered. Her eyes skimmed the list, stopping abruptly at a familiar name, Emily Miller. Her heart skipped a beat. Karen looked up sharply, scanning the cabin. There, near the back, was her daughter, seated quietly, her expression unreadable. Karen's chest tightened. Emily wasn't just a passenger. She was watching, perhaps judging, everything Karen had done. The revelation hit like a tidal wave. Karen sat frozen, her thoughts a chaotic swirl of fear, guilt, and an ache she couldn't quite name. She had always thought of herself as a professional, someone who treated everyone equally. But Emily's presence forced her to confront the truth. Had she upheld the values she claimed to believe in, or had she failed the very people who needed fairness the most? Karen's hands clenched tightly in her lap as she realized the weight of the question wasn't hers alone to answer. It would be decided by every action, every word, every choice she made from here on. The hum of the engines provided a steady backdrop as Karen Miller stood in the galley, staring out at the cabin. Her eyes drifted toward the back of the plane, where Emily sat, quietly flipping through a folder. Karen's chest tightened as she wrestled with the realization that her daughter, her own Emily, was among the passengers she was serving. The weight of their strained relationship pressed on her like the cabin pressure at 30,000 feet. She had thought of Emily often in recent years, their debates replaying in her mind like old recordings. And now, here she was, a silent witness to the unfolding tensions. Karen approached slowly, her professional mask slipping with each step. Emily noticed her before she reached the row, her eyes locking onto Karen's. There was no hostility in her expression, only a quiet determination that Karen recognized all too well. "Emily," Karen began, her voice softer than she intended. "What are you doing here?" Emily set down the folder, tilting her head slightly. "I could ask you the same thing, Mom," she said, her tone measured but pointed. Karen hesitated, then gestured toward the empty seat beside Emily. "May I?" Emily nodded, and Karen lowered herself into the seat, her hands clasped tightly. In her lap, for a moment neither spoke. The silence between them was heavy, filled with words unsaid. "I'm here for work," Emily finally said, breaking the quiet. "I've been collaborating with Michelle Thomas on an initiative with the ACLU. We're building a case to address systemic discrimination in air travel." Karen's stomach churned. She had suspected Emily's involvement with the Thomases, but hearing it confirmed struck her differently. "You've been watching everything," Karen said, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily nodded. "I have. And I've been waiting to see what you'd do." The words landed heavily, and Karen exhaled slowly. "Emily, I didn't—" She trailed off, searching for the right words. "I thought I was doing my job, following the rules." Emily's gaze softened, but her tone remained firm. "Mom, following the rules isn't enough when the rules themselves are flawed. That's what I've been trying to tell you for years." Karen looked away, her thoughts racing. She had always prided herself on her professionalism, her adherence to protocol. But now, sitting beside her daughter, she couldn't ignore the cracks in that foundation. Nearby, Michelle Thomas stood in the aisle, addressing a small group of passengers who had gathered around her seat. Her calm, authoritative voice carried, just enough to draw others' attention. "This isn't just about us," she said. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The passengers nodded, murmuring their agreement. One by one, they began signing a petition Michelle had drafted on her phone, demanding accountability from the airline. The petition was passed from row to row, gathering momentum as more passengers added their names. James, seated beside his mother, recorded the scene with quiet focus. "This is incredible," he whispered to Michelle. "People are really coming together." Michelle smiled faintly, her eyes glancing toward Karen, who was still seated with Emily. "It's amazing. What happens when people feel heard?" she said. Back in her seat, Karen listened as Emily spoke about her work with the ACLU. She described case after case, each one painting a vivid picture of the systemic issues plaguing the industry. "It's not just about screening procedures or ticketing policies," Emily said. "It's about how people are seen or not seen by the systems that are supposed to serve them." Karen's eyes stung, but she blinked the emotion away. "I didn't realize," she admitted quietly. "I thought I was being fair." "Fairness isn't just about treating everyone the same," Emily replied gently. "It's about recognizing when someone needs something different to have an equal chance." The words struck a chord, echoing the debates they'd had years ago. Karen nodded slowly, her defenses crumbling. "I see that now." Emily's expression softened. "It's never too late to change, Mom." As the petition made its way through the cabin, Captain Chen approached the Thomases. "I wanted to thank you," he said to Michelle. "What you're doing here matters." Michelle smiled warmly. "Thank you, Captain. Your leadership has made a difference." Karen watched the exchange from her seat, her heart heavy with a mix of guilt and admiration. She stood and approached Michelle, feeling the weight of each step. "Mrs. Thomas," Karen began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I want to apologize." Michelle looked up, her expression unreadable. Karen continued, "I realize now that my actions earlier weren't just about protocol. They were part of a system that needs to change, and I want to be part of that change." Michelle studied Karen for a moment before nodding. "It takes courage to admit that," she said. "Thank you." Karen exhaled, relief washing over her. She glanced at the petition in Michelle's hands. "May I sign?" she asked. Michelle handed her the phone, and Karen added her name to the growing list. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. Just as the cabin seemed to settle into a calm rhythm, the plane shuddered violently. Gasps rippled through the passengers as the turbulence grew more severe. The flight attendants quickly moved to reassure everyone, their voices firm and practiced. "Everyone, please fasten your seatbelts." Captain Chen's voice came over the intercom, calm and authoritative. "We're experiencing some turbulence. It should pass shortly." Karen moved instinctively, helping passengers secure their belongings and checking seatbelts. Michael, ever calm under pressure, assisted a nearby passenger who had spilled water. In the commotion, as the turbulence subsided, a quiet sense of solidarity seemed to fill the cabin. Passengers exchanged reassured smiles, and the tension that had once divided them began to dissolve. Karen looked toward Emily, who smiled faintly. "See?" Emily said. "We're all in this together." Karen nodded, her heart lighter than it had been all day. "I see it now." The plane jolted violently, sending a collective gasp rippling through the cabin. Overhead bins rattled, and loose items tumbled to the floor. Karen Miller gripped the edge of a seat, her heart racing as she steadied herself. The intercom crackled. "Unto life, Captain Chen's calm voice cutting through the tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. The crew is here to assist if needed." Karen sprang into action, her instincts taking over. She moved quickly down the aisle, checking that passengers were secure. A young woman clutched her, toddler tightly, her face pale with fear. Karen crouched beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her arm. "You're safe," she said softly. "Just hold on tight. We'll get through this." The woman nodded, her grip tightening around her child. Karen moved on, her gaze scanning the cabin for signs of distress. The tension was palpable, but something unexpected was happening. Passengers were helping each other. A man reached across the aisle to secure a bag that had slid out. A teenager handed a bottle of water to an elderly woman, clutching the armrest. Near the middle of the plane, Michael Thomas unbuckled his seatbelt despite the shaking. "Stay here," he told Michelle firmly, before moving toward a passenger slumped over in their seat. The turbulence had triggered a fainting spell, and Michael's years of emergency medical training kicked in. "Excuse me," he said to the passenger beside the unconscious man. "I'm a doctor. Let me help." The passenger nodded quickly, stepping aside. Michael assessed the man, checking his pulse and airway. He motioned to a flight attendant. "I need some water and a cold compress." Karen arrived moments later, handing him the requested items. She watched as Michael worked with calm precision, gently bringing the passenger back to consciousness. The man blinked groggily, his color returning. "You're going to be fine," Michael assured him. "Just take deep breaths." Karen couldn't help but feel a pang of admiration. Michael's composure was remarkable, and his presence had a calming effect on those around him. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For stepping in." Michael met her gaze, his expression kind but serious. "We're all in this together," he said simply. As the turbulence subsided slightly, the cabin began to settle. Passengers whispered reassurances to one another, and the initial fear gave way to a sense of solidarity. Michelle took the opportunity to stand and address those nearby. "This has been a challenging flight," she began, her voice steady despite the occasional jolt. "But look around you. We're proving that when we come together, we're stronger than the challenges we face." The passengers nodded, some even applauding softly. James, ever ready with his camera, captured the moment, his live stream continuing to draw thousands of viewers. The comments flooding in were overwhelmingly supportive. "Heroes on board. This is what humanity looks like." Sending strength to everyone on that flight. Michelle glanced toward Karen, her expression unreadable but not unkind. Karen felt a lump rise in her throat. She hadn't expected to find inspiration in the very people she had been so quick to scrutinize earlier. In the brief calm, Karen returned to the galley, where Emily was waiting. Her daughter's expression was softer now, the tension from their earlier conversation replaced with something gentler. "You did good back there," Emily said, nodding, toward the cabin. "Helping that family, helping everyone." Karen leaned against the counter, her shoulders sagging slightly. "I'm just doing my job," she said, though the words felt hollow even to her. Emily tilted her head. "No, Mum, you're doing more than that. You're starting to see people, not just as passengers or protocol, but as individuals with stories. That's what makes the difference." Karen looked down, her hands clasped tightly in front of "I've made mistakes," she admitted. "I've let the rules blind me to what's right." Emily reached out, placing a hand over Karen's. "It's never too late to change," she said softly. "What matters is what you do next." Karen nodded, swallowing hard. "I want to do better," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I will do better." Just as the plane seemed to find its rhythm, another sharp jolt rocked the cabin. The intercom crackled again, Captain Chen's voice calm but firm. Ladies and gentlemen, due to the turbulence, we've decided to make an unscheduled landing at the nearest airport for safety checks. Please remain seated and follow the crew's instructions. The announcement sent a ripple of murmurs through the passengers, but the earlier sense of unity held firm. Karen moved quickly to reassure those who looked particularly anxious. "This is just a precaution," she explained to an elderly man gripping his armrest. "We'll land safely, and the crew will guide you through every step." Michael and Michelle exchanged a glance, their expressions resolute. James, ever the chronicler, whispered to his mother, "This is going to make the story even bigger." Michelle smiled faintly. "It's not just a story, James. It's a lesson." As the plane began its descent, Karen took a deep breath. The day had been a storm in more ways than one, but she felt a quiet determination rising within her. This wasn't just a detour for the flight. It was a turning point for her, for the passengers, and perhaps for the system she had long served without question. The plane touched down with a soft thud, and a ripple of relief spread through the cabin as the passengers exhaled collectively. Outside the window, emergency vehicles lined the tarmac, their flashing lights reflecting off the damp pavement. Karen Miller stood near the cockpit, her hands clasped tightly. She'd been through countless flights in her career, but none like this. This wasn't just about turbulence, it was about transformation, her own and everyone else's. As the passengers began to disembark, the crew guided them into the terminal, ensuring everyone was accounted for. Karen noticed Michelle Thomas walking beside her family, her presence commanding but calm. The Thomases were met by a group of reporters who had arrived, alerted by James's now viral live stream. Cameras flashed and microphones were thrust forward as questions flew their way. "Mrs. Thomas, what do you hope to achieve with today's actions?" one reporter asked. Michelle paused, her gaze steady. "We're not here to tear anyone down," she said. "We're here to build something better, a system that treats everyone with dignity and fairness." Michael stepped forward, his tone measured. "This isn't just about us. It's about ensuring that no one has to face these challenges again. That's why we're speaking out." Karen stood at a distance, watching the scene unfold. Her chest tightened as she listened to their words. She had spent years believing in the infallibility of her profession, but today had stripped away that illusion. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, her heart pounding. "Excuse me," Karen said, her voice clear but trembling slightly. The reporters turned toward her, their cameras now focused on the unexpected figure in her flight attendant uniform. "I'd like to say something." Michelle turned, her expression unreadable, as Karen met her gaze. Karen's hands trembled slightly, but she held them steady. "Mrs. Thomas, Dr. Thomas," she began, her voice cracking slightly. "I want to apologize." The murmurs from the reporters hushed as Karen continued. "I realize now that my actions earlier weren't just about following protocol. They were part of a larger system that has failed you and so many others. I made assumptions that I shouldn't have, and for that I am deeply sorry." Michelle's expression softened, and Michael gave a slight nod. "Acknowledging mistakes is the first step toward change," Michelle said, her tone firm but not unkind. Karen swallowed hard. "I don't just want to apologize. I want to be part of the solution. If there's anything I can do to help with your efforts, please let me know." James, who had been filming the entire exchange, lowered his camera slightly. "That's a start," he said, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Inside the terminal, the passengers began to relax, some sitting on the chairs lining the walls, others chatting quietly. A sense of camaraderie had settled over the group, born out of the shared experience of the flight. Michelle moved from group to group, speaking with passengers and thanking them for their support. "Here," one passenger said, handing her a notebook filled with signatures. We thought you might need this for your petition. Michelle smiled warmly. Thank you. Every name counts. Nearby, Karen sat beside Emily, her shoulders slumped but her expression determined. Emily placed a hand on her mother's arm. That was brave, she said softly, apologizing like that. Karen shook her head. It's just a start. I've got a long way to go. Emily nodded. That's all anyone can ask for. That you start. Karen turned to her daughter, her voice trembling. I didn't see it before. Everything you've been trying to tell me. I see it now, Emily, and I want to do better. For you, for everyone. Emily smiled faintly. Then you're already doing better. As the hours passed, passengers exchanged contact information, vowing to stay connected and support each other's efforts. Michelle and Emily began organizing a small group meeting in the terminal, discussing the next steps for their campaign. Karen listened from the periphery, taking notes and offering to help where she could. It wasn't about making amends anymore. It was about making a difference. News of the flight's events continued to spread. On the overhead televisions, a breaking news banner scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Airline under scrutiny after viral incident highlights discrimination. Shortly after, a representative from the airline arrived to address the situation. We've been made aware of the events on Flight 216, she began, her tone measured. We are committed to reviewing our policies and ensuring fair treatment for all passengers. Effective immediately, we will be implementing mandatory bias training for all employees and conducting a comprehensive audit of our procedures. Karen glanced at Michelle, whose expression was resolute but measured. It's a start, Michelle said quietly, but there's more work to be done. As the announcement concluded, Karen approached Michelle once more. Thank you, she said, her voice steady, for giving me the chance to learn and change. Michelle nodded. Change doesn't happen overnight, Karen, but it starts with people willing to take the first step. Karen smiled faintly, a sense of purpose settling over her. I won't waste it. The grand hall of the Washington, D.C. Conference Center was filled with murmurs of anticipation. Overhead, banners displayed the event's theme, Equity in Aviation, a New Era. Attendees from all corners of the airline industry, along with government officials, activists, and everyday travelers, filled the seats, their collective focus on the stage. It was a pivotal moment, not just for the Thomases, Karen, or Emily, but for the future of air travel. Karen Miller sat in the second row, her heart pounding against her ribcage. 6 months ago, she couldn't have imagined herself here, let alone about to speak to a room of this magnitude. Her transformation had been as turbulent as the flight that had brought her to this point, but it had also been enlightening. Emily's quiet encouragement beside her steadied Karen's nerves, while Michelle's resolute presence felt like an anchor. The MC stepped up to the podium, his voice warm and inviting. Our next speaker is someone whose journey reflects the power of humility, growth, and the willingness to embrace change. Please join me in welcoming Karen Miller. Karen rose, applause rippling around her as she climbed the steps to the podium. She adjusted the microphone, her hands trembling slightly. Looking out over the sea of faces, she took a deep breath, grounding herself in the memory of Emily's words from months ago. It's never too late to change. Good morning, Karen began, her voice steady despite her nerves. 6 months ago, I was just another flight attendant doing my job, following the rules. I believed that fairness meant treating everyone the same. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was wrong. She paused, letting the words settle in the room. On Flight 216, I made a mistake rooted in a system that I failed to question. I assumed the rules I was following were enough, but they weren't. That flight taught me that fairness isn't about sameness, it's about equity. It's about seeing people, hearing their stories, and understanding their experiences. Karen's voice softened as she continued. That lesson didn't come easy. It came through the courage and grace of a family who showed me the power of resilience and truth. The Thomases reminded me that change starts with recognizing our blind spots and committing to do better. She glanced briefly toward Michelle and Michael, who sat in the front row, their faces calm but focused. I'm here today because they gave me the chance to grow, and I'm committed to using that growth to make sure no one else faces what they did. The applause that followed was thunderous, and Karen felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She stepped down, returning to her seat with a mix of relief and resolve. Emily reached over, squeezing her hand briefly. You nailed it, she whispered, pride shining in her eyes. Michelle and Emily took the stage next, presenting the results of their 6-month campaign. Michelle began, her tone commanding but compassionate. The events of Flight 216 weren't unique. They reflected systemic issues that have persisted for far too long, but they also showed us that change is possible. Emily followed, presenting data and stories that underscored the movement's success. New bias training protocols adopted by multiple airlines, increased transparency in passenger screening processes, and a rise in actionable reports. Progress isn't a distant hope, she concluded. It's here and it's happening, but the work isn't done. The lights dimmed as the MC introduced James's short film, Flight 216, A Journey to Justice. The audience watched in rapt silence as footage of the turbulent flight played out on screen. Karen's apology, the Thomases' advocacy, and the unity of passengers working together. Interspersed were interviews with passengers, crew, and activists, their voices weaving a tapestry of resilience and hope. The film ended with James's voiceover, "Change begins when we choose to see each other." The room erupted into a standing ovation, applause echoing for several minutes. James, standing in the back of the room, felt a swell of pride. Turning to his mother, he whispered, "I think we made a difference." Michelle placed a hand on his shoulder. "You didn't just tell a story, James. You showed the world what's possible." After the presentations, Karen found herself standing beside Emily, watching the buzz of activity as attendees mingled and exchanged ideas. Karen broke the silence. "I couldn't have done this without you," she said quietly. Emily smiled, her expression soft. "Maybe, but you're the one who decided to change." Karen looked away briefly, her voice tinged with emotion. "I just hope it's enough." Emily placed a hand on her mother's arm. "It's a start, and you're not doing it alone." As the day wound down, Karen joined Michelle and Michael in conversation with the airline's representative. "We've issued an official statement promising reforms," the representative explained. "Our next steps include implementing comprehensive bias training, creating a passenger advocacy board, and conducting regular audits of our procedures." Karen nodded, her voice steady. "It's a good beginning, but the real work will be in keeping those promises." Michelle added, "We'll be watching and helping to make sure that happens." Later that evening, Karen and the Thomases boarded a flight back home. The atmosphere on board was different this time, lighter, more hopeful. Karen noticed passengers chatting with the crew, exchanging smiles. It wasn't a perfect world, but it was better, and it was only the beginning. As the plane ascended, Karen glanced out the window, the horizon glowing with the last light of day. She turned to Emily, who sat beside her. "I'm proud of you," Karen said softly. Emily smiled, leaning back in her seat. "I'm proud of us." Across the aisle, James was already planning his next project, while Michelle and Michael shared a quiet moment. Karen felt a surge of gratitude. For the Thomases, for her daughter, and for the chance to rise above her past mistakes. The flight leveled out, the cabin settling into a calm rhythm. For the first time in months, Karen felt at peace, not because the journey was over, but because it was just beginning. Karen stepped onto the new flight, her heart lighter and her purpose clearer. For her, this was more than just the end of a turbulent journey. It was the beginning of a shared mission with the Thomases to spark change. Together, they had turned a moment of injustice into a powerful movement that resonated far beyond the walls of the airplane cabin. Their story wasn't just about accountability, it was about hope, unity, and the courage to create a better future. Karen and the Thomases remind us all that change starts with small but courageous actions. If you were in Karen's shoes, how would you respond to such a challenge? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to like and share this story to spread its powerful message, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring and thought-provoking stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.